Thank you to the Ceramic Congress for hosting this event and inviting me to share my obsession with surface design. I'm Maureen Mills. My story begins with my Irish grandmother, who came from a small town outside of Galway called Spittal on Galway Bay. Across the bay, they could see the Aran Islands while they worked the family bog in a landscape punctuated by never-ending stone walls. When I was 9 and home from school with the mumps, my grandmother taught me to knit. I remember struggling to hold the yarn and manage the needles with my 9-year-old hands, but loving every minute of sharing that time with her. I didn't return to knitting until years later and discovered that as much as I loved being surrounded by colorful yarns while shopping in the local yarn store, it was the single color of Aran-style knitting emanating from the Aran Islands that truly inspired me. The texture and pattern created by the twisting yarn added visual interest of shadow and light from a single color. The Aran Islands were filled with fishing towns, and each pattern in the sweater they knit was meant to tell a story, to bring prosperity or health or wishing a good catch. The stories varied depending on how they were combined to make a unique design, and you knew there was meaning knit into every stitch. Around the same time when I was 9, I recall receiving a small battery-operated potter's wheel from my parents. I was fascinated with forming small objects from modeling clay, and now I could make my own pottery. It of course didn't work, but it likely instilled in me the desire to learn to create on the potter's wheel. My early clay work focused on slip trailing in ways that were symmetrical and design-centered. I was drawn to slip trailing because of the relief surface it created, allowing me to explore pattern and texture simultaneously. Exploring hints of color with composition, I incorporated elements of punctuation to add shadow and pattern to the surface, drawing inspiration once again from nature, design, and architecture. After writing an article on slip trailing for Clay Times magazine, I was asked by Lark Books to write a book that would be called Surface Design for Ceramics. It was a year-long project of writing, researching, making, and exploring. Each demonstration for the book was individually presented, and in my mind, every technique played off of each other and was soon reflected in my own body of work. I started wood firing around this time as well, and felt that rather intuitively my decorated surfaces would work well in a wood kiln. I minimized the color of slips I was using, striving for more subtle pattern that would become one with the surface through firing. One of the challenges I gave myself in preparing each technique demonstration for my book was to explore a single motif in as many ways as possible. This really allowed me a strategy to explore scale and pattern to suit the needs of the demonstration, but soon translated into my own body of work. Incorporating brushwork and sgraffito, slip trailing and altering, or latex resist with slips as with these 3 jars, my own sense of design expanded. The kiln itself had demands that challenged me to make work that fit in the kiln, taking advantage of the variable nature of atmospheric firing. Using primarily black and white slip, some patterns were more bold and others more subtle, relating to the white-on-white designs from my earlier days of knitting, but always creating a sense of texture on the surface. Designing work that fit together side by side or in spaces between other pieces in the kiln or in nesting sets became a guiding strategy to exploring the design of form as well as surface in the wood kiln. Teapots are a perfect canvas for me to demonstrate on. In this teapot in the upper left, thin incised and inlaid lines create a vertical movement behind the overall scrolling pattern. Part of that scrolling pattern then breaks off into a sort of leaf or willow pattern, which is incorporated into sgraffito patterns, and the 2 techniques combine in the piece on the right. I continue to explore the strategies of using punctuation like seams or ridges, or handles and feet on the forms to guide my composition. And in my mind, these complex surfaces would only be enhanced by the flashing of color or the melting of ash on the glazes. My work took a rather dramatic shift when I began using carving and inlay techniques and introducing text as a design element in my work. Incorporating resist and monochromatic glazing in the beginning, I worked with this technique extensively on a variety of forms, searching for the right elements to combine. Continuing exploration through some simple forms like those tumblers, I went back to a monochromatic theme using black glaze to mask off graphic elements on the form. Text was carved through a layer of wax into the brown clay that had been randomly brushed with white slip, and then the carving was inlaid with black slip before the piece dried. Text areas were then masked with wax resist and glazed after bisque firing, creating linear and graphic elements against the random brushwork and text. I don't know if you can sense my MO here, but my obsession with surface decoration compels me to continue to keep asking questions. What else can I do to this piece? When I'm teaching workshops, one of the things I often try to encourage students is to push past what might be an obvious solution. One tenet I often refer to is that incorporating a second surface technique will almost always make more of an impact. For me, it often goes way beyond two techniques. Incorporating more color was next, as I also increased scale. We all know that bigger is better, right? Well, not always, of course, but I did have an exhibition in a large gallery that really required me to address scale. So I embraced the simple curve to get to these larger forms, to embark on forms that would approach 3 feet tall. Quite a contrast to the tiny square boxes I was also making. Using colored glazes and underglazes, I chose a matte green glaze that had quite a bit of variety in the wood and soda kilns, along with accents of red. Perhaps you can see in some of these forms the variation in direction that the text is applied. This is an attempt to create visual layers which, like quilt making, the pattern begins to overlap. The technique on that teapot and the other text work is called mishima, carving through wax resist and inlaying with black slip like in the previous description. The layers are really brought out by the edges that are created in the red underglaze and text areas. As these larger forms evolved, I began incorporating stamping techniques as well to create accents and borders. And then, because there can never be too many techniques, slip trailing also returned to these larger forms and adding yet another layering technique. These tumblers incorporate slip trailing, stamping, inlay, resists as well. In this piece, the text actually runs right over the top of the slip trailing, which adds to the story of this piece. And these are particularly good examples of the contribution the kiln makes to added layers of information as the ash begins to melt more of the glaze. As I'm sure many of you have experienced, I ran into a slump along the way and found that I was not interested in working on the potter's wheel for a while. So, for about 18 months, I continued to work with clay, but using very simple hand-building techniques and firing earthenware in an electric kiln. I wanted to explore surface techniques while doing hand building and realized that with slab building, I could decorate first and then build the forms, which was opposite from the way I worked on the potter's wheel. I used similar decorating techniques but combined them in completely different ways, embracing a number of new tools and styles of organization. When I returned to the potter's wheel, it seemed to come naturally to begin altering the surface and add texture and pattern while I was throwing. Exploring the seemingly simple moon jar form allowed me to play with scale and proportion as well as various surface techniques, applying texture before the pieces were stretched. I continued to experiment with other forms and exploiting the results of the wood kiln and additional layers to the surface exploration. Inspirations continued to come from nature, design, and fabric as well. These thrown forms were decorated with texture stamps and then stretched both on and off the wheel to complete the form. The slow hand stretching gave these thrown forms a different sense of breath and movement, and in a way melds throwing and hand building together. Multiple techniques are incorporated into this work like all the others. Text is written over the texture, and slip trailing creates fabric-like pattern and even more texture. And accents of color exaggerate the effects of the wood kiln, running over and sometimes obscuring the decoration. And now, some of this work has begged for even more surface decoration. All that is left was adding gold luster in post-firing techniques. Like the textured patterns of Aran knitting, these pieces are meant to tell a story, as individual works but also as a body of work. My nature is to continue to ask questions and discovering what might be. With introspection and reflection, I allowed myself the room to meander through techniques and processes to arrive at this place. Incorporating text into my work may have allowed for some deeper reflection to take place, where I've come from, and to tell the story of where I might be going. Thank you again to the Ceramic School for hosting this event. Please visit my website to see more of my work.